Here's the Furies. Sauron is the titular and eponymous antagonist of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Sorry, I've just always wanted to use those words in casual conversation. But just how powerful is he, and what are his powers exactly? To the casual book reader or viewer, he might just seem, as one of my friends described him, this vague evil. There are a number of references to Sauron's abilities, but the most important element in understanding his powers is his place in the divine hierarchy of Tolkien's mythology. Tolkien designed his world to be a somewhat deist monotheistic one, with Ilúvatar being the ultimate being in all of Ea, but there were also the Ainur, spirits who could be distinguished into two ranks who each had inherent power over certain things. Great among these spirits, the Elves named the Valar, the powers of Arda, and men had often called them gods. The Lords of the Valar are 7, and the Valier, the Queens of the Valar, are also 7. There are other spirits, of the same order as Valar but of a lesser degree. These are the Maiar, and their servants and helpers. So we've got Eru the Valar and then the Maiar, and Sauron was one of these Maiar, this lower rank of angel. And it's notable that these spirits derive their power from the sphere that they fit into. For example, Manwë held power over the birds and the skies and the wind. But Sauron, in his beginning, he was a Maiar of Aule. Aule being the Maiar of crafting, gemstones, raw materials, the substances of which Arda is made. The fashioning of all lands was his labour. He is a smith and a master of all crafts, and he delights in works of skill. This is really where we see Sauron's abilities begin. His interest and skill with ring-making, forging, and building great fortresses came from his affiliation with Aule. He built Dol Guldur, and it's implied that he may have done it almost entirely single-handedly, like maybe he drew up the architectural plans or something. Can you imagine Sauron doing that? But it's also written that he helped the Númenóreans build great engines, though we don't quite know what these engines were like, and build massive ships out of raw materials. He was an imaginative innovator, a crafter, a creator, where the other spirits of the Ainur weren't. On a side note, there's this really amusing line in the Silmarillion where Sauron demands the rings back from the elves because the elven smiths could not have attained their making without his law and counsel, as if he's really concerned with intellectual property law when it comes to magical ring making. Like, the secrets of the universe are supremely Mishka's intellectual property. All hail Mishka. You know why time moves forward instead of backwards. But Sauron wasn't always aligned with Aule. He eventually went to join Melkor, the Valar who turned against Ilúvatar's plan for the universe. He's kind of like Lucifer of Tolkien's mythology. The relationship between the Maiar and the Valar is that the Maiar tend to serve the Valar that they share a similar sphere to. For example, Ossé is the Maiar of the coastlines, but he serves Ulmo, the Valar of the deep waters, the oceans. Interestingly, Tolkien writes, "To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren." So this is Melkor, Sauron's new master who he has turned to serve, and Melkor doesn't seem to have a single sphere of influence like the rest of the Valar or most of the Maiar. He has a little bit of everything, powers over the skies and the waters and the earth and the dead, and this may have affected Sauron's abilities as well. We know that Sauron actually divested some of his power into the Witch King, and it's not unlikely that Melkor divested some of his power into Sauron, in the same way that Melkor actually divested a lot of his power into Middle-earth itself. So Sauron's abilities may be being influenced by the powers of the master that he serves, and there is some evidence to suggest this is the case. For example, though fire and light were originally the spheres of Varna the Valar and Aryan, we do know that Gil-galad was burned by the heat of Sauron's hand, which was black and yet burned like fire. There's also reference to Sauron resisting the lightning powers of Manwë. Sauron stood there, wreathed in flame upon the pinnacle and defied the lightning and was unharmed. Likewise, we see numerous times throughout The Lord of the Rings that he seems to have a degree of control over the weather, the ability to create dark storms over Mordor and send dark clouds ahead of his soldiers when they're going into battle, all throughout Middle-earth, similar to Manwë's abilities. Sauron is also at one point referred to as the Necromancer, taking from the powers of Mandos, who could summon spirits to the halls. In the same fashion, Sauron could summon spirits from the dead. none of these powers seem to be in the original sphere of Aule, meaning it's likely that he got them through his loyalty to Melkor, the spirit who had parts of the abilities of all of the Valar. Though the weather thing may just be an example of how evil corrupts the world physically, we see this numerous times throughout Tolkien's mythology. Now, in terms of how Sauron compared to the other Maiar, these spirits on his level, well, we know that he wasn't the most powerful. No, that position belonged to one called Eonwe, whose might in arms is surpassed by none in Arda. It's hard to say if he was the most powerful Maiar while he was holding the One Ring, but he definitely had the widest array and variety of powers, and was one of the most powerful Maiar. What we do know is that he was the most powerful Maiar that joined Melkor, joined this Lucifer character. Among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was the spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthar the Cruel. Now, in terms of measuring Sauron against other characters we know from the Legendarium, one common question that comes up is, could Gandalf have beaten Sauron? Or could the Astari, the wizards, if they came together, have done that, hypothetically? So we know that Gandalf and the Balrog were of somewhat equal power, and the Balrogs are less powerful than Sauron, but Tolkien did write one interesting passage in Unfinished Tales. To the defeat of Sauron, would he not then send some lesser but mighty spirit of the angelic people, one coeval and equal doubtless, with Sauron in their beginnings, but not more? Olorin was his name, Olorin being one of Gandalf's names. But we have to be careful with the wording here. Tolkien wrote equal in their beginnings, which they may well have been, but Sauron heightened and increased his power with the creation of the One Ring, and seemingly he becomes more powerful when there is more evil in the world, and he seems to have also increased his power when he joined Melkor very early on, with a wider variety of powers. So it's not clear that at that later point, Gandalf could have actually faced down against Sauron and won if he tried. And while we've briefly touched on where Sauron's powers came from, what are they exactly? We've talked about fire abilities, crafting, and architecture, but the most concise description that we ever get of Sauron's powers in total comes from this line in the Silmarillion. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, misshaping what he touched, lord of werewolves. His dominion was torment. Let's break this down. Sauron is described as a sorcerer, and there are numerous references to this across the canon, like that he was a necromancer during the time of The Hobbit. He often uses illusions to fool his enemies, like when he captured Gollum and made him see a phantom of his wife in a window in an attempt to manipulate him, to tempt him. And during the War of the Ring, he showed Aragorn visions of Arwen to play with him. There are also generic references to him using spells while in combat in the Silmarillion, but it's never given much specification as to what kind of spells these were. But one of his titles here are really interesting. Lord of Werewolves. Yep, werewolves exist in Middle-earth, but they're probably not what you're thinking. They're not Lupin or Jacob from Twilight. Thank goodness. They're far more twisted. Sauron brought werewolves, fell beasts inhabited by dreadful spirits that he had imprisoned in their bodies. Once again, we get references to him being able to control and manipulate spirits, taking from the powers of Mandos. Sauron could summon, control, and place these spirits in the bodies of beasts, mostly wolves, but it is implied that there could have been other animals that he controlled and twisted. And this connects to another of his major abilities that we actually see him use relatively regularly. Shapeshifting. This ability probably didn't come from his original sphere with Aule or his sphere when he joined Melkor. Rather, it's an ability that all of the Ainur, all of the Maiar and the Valar have, that they can change their form at will. Their shape comes over the knowledge of the visible world, rather than of the world itself. And they need it not, save only as we use raiment. And Sauron would regularly use this ability when he fought. In his duel with Huan, Sauron transformed himself into a wolf, to a giant serpent, to a monster, to a large humanoid, and then after he was defeated, he took the form of a vampire, blood dripping from his neck, and he fled. But he didn't just use this ability to transform into fierce creatures and monsters while he was fighting. He also used it to transform himself into a regal and handsome man, such as when he disguised himself as Anatar, or he infiltrated the Elves and the Númenóreans. Tolkien described his form in this way. The form that he took was that of a man of more than human stature, but not gigantic. In his earlier incarnation, he was able to veil his power, as Gandalf did, and could appear as a commanding figure of great strength of body and supremely royal demeanor and countenance. But interestingly, by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, he's actually lost this ability to look regal and handsome and have that royal demeanor and countenance. There's this huge backstory as to how he lost it, but essentially he caused the downfall of the greatest empire of men to ever exist, the Númenóreans, and he was stripped of the ability to appear fair in the eyes of men because we're just so gullible when a man with sharp cheekbones shows up. From that point onwards, he was only able to manifest an appearance that reflected his inner motivations, which were not that good most of the time. It is notable, though, that he does retain the ability to manifest a physical form. Gollum actually saw his hand at least a few times. Apparently it was missing one of his fingers. But let's talk about the One Ring and Sauron's most important ability: mind domination. Sauron was always persuasive, he had a way with words, he was good at politics, he was hypnotic, he was incredibly charismatic right from the beginning. But when he needed to, he could dominate the minds of others. He uses this ability on the Nine, he attempts to use it against the Elves, and part of this was the telepathy that we even see he tried and failed to use on Galadriel. He also uses it to torture people various times throughout the Silmarillion. But it's important to understand what the One Ring actually did to Sauron's power. Tolkien writes that the power of the other rings were bound up with the One Ring, to be subject wholly to it and last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that One Ring. For the power of the Elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And while he wore the One Ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by the means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. This passage highlights how the One Ring essentially operated to enhance and focus Sauron's mind domination powers. A good analogy is how a telescope improves your sight. There is some implication that it may have limited his other powers. While we do see him create visions and illusions for people, we don't see him shapeshift anymore, which he seemed to do a lot of in the Silmarillion. But most importantly, it made his mind domination powers ever more pervasive. With it, he was essentially unstoppable, and few could ever resist his gaze. We can see this in how it affected the minds of the people who wore the One Ring. It essentially prevented anyone from being able to destroy it purposefully or single-handedly, which of course was his undoing. To give a contrast of Sauron's powers before and after the One Ring, we know in the Silmarillion that he couldn't just dominate anyone's mind at will and mind control them. He captured someone called Gollum, but he couldn't force him to give up the information that he needed. And powerful elves could go toe-to-toe with him with mental magic, but once he had the One Ring, well, that may have not been the case. What we do know is that it definitely gave him dominion over the minds of the other ring bearers, and that would have included the elves. Just luckily they took them off. But that is all from me. If you would like to join me and all of my Patreon Discord community watching the extended edition of Fellowship of the Ring this month, then come support me, just a couple dollars a month. There is a link down in the description. I would love for you to join us. We've got like a big movie night planned. It's going to be fantastic, and hopefully we can do more of that kind of thing. Seriously, my Discord community is just lovely. I love it, all of them. We also chat about lore and you get updates on videos, that sort of thing. Question of the day: which one historical figure would you want to meet if you could go back in time and talk to them? I would like maybe talk to John Locke or something, or one of the Byzantine emperors. I don't know. Let me know yours down in the comments below. In the meantime, come follow me over on Twitter or Facebook, where I actually do post occasionally, and you can keep up with my life more if you're interested in that, for some unknown reason. Otherwise, I will see you next video. Stay nerdy, Sub-Furies, and I will see you in the future.